Warning, I'm talking fast to try to make this video as short as possible.
How's it going today? I want to talk about some of the things you need to not overlook when you're buying a boat. So you need to ask a lot of questions, make sure you're comfortable with the buyer, and some of these things are pretty major. So if you're buying, it depends on what kind of boat you're buying. Maybe you're buying like a bass boat with an outboard motor. First thing I do is Google the brand of the boat and the motor. Are they good? So Mercury, Volvo, they're great inboard motors. Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, Evinrude, Johnson, they're great outboard motors. But I Googled the brand of the boat. So this is a Chaparral. And for a lake boat, these are some of the best boats you can buy. They're up there, they're just maybe even past Sea Ray, but below Boston Whaler. So some of the things I ask first when I call the buyer: do you have a clean title for trailer and the boat? And what I do is I try to ask a lot of questions on the phone, because sometimes they won't reply back to you because they're afraid. They know you're gonna be detailed when you're buying this boat, and they know they're not gonna get something past you. So I think that's always great when I ask all these questions and then they never respond back to me, because they want to sell the boat. They just want to sell to somebody they can kind of, F over. So let me go over a bunch of stuff, go through the trailer, inside, motor, lower end, all that stuff, and just kind of say, here's what you need to look at. Now it all varies on what kind of price you're spending. Now if you're going to spend $10,000, you might want to bring it into a shop and have them do a compression check. A compression gauge is about $100, but that way it'll save you a lot of money. I would always do a compression check, or at least run the boat on the lake for at least 15 minutes. So here we go. I'm gonna start with the lower end. Okay, when I'm inspecting a lower end, first thing I kind of check is the skeg. So is the skeg damaged? Now when I bought this boat, the person I bought it from hit it on the ground back in the driveway. So I had to do a full repair. I was aware of that. And they had the piece, so that means I know they didn't lose it in the lake going full blast. But I wouldn't worry so much about the paint wear, because I had the motor up kind of in a shallow water and it was rubbing in some sand. So the paint wear can happen. You just don't want to have a bunch of nicks or damage. Then you check the prop, because these can be a couple $100 up to $500, even more maybe. So check the prop. Does it have any damage? I put a new prop on here because I wanted a 4-blade prop for efficiency and better cornering and better hole shot. Then you want to check your trim. Make sure there's nothing leaking here. Trim fluid lines down here. Make sure there's nothing leaking here. And make sure your trim, when you start the boat, goes up and down and stays there. Also, make sure you check your bellows. The boots inside here, you don't want to see any cracking. That can get expensive too. There's probably 3 bellows. Make sure the wires aren't wore through. This is just visual stuff. In a little bit, I'll talk about what you want to do when it's run. So you just want to really get in here and look. So like here's the bellow. These rubber boots here, you want to make sure you don't have any leaking or cracks. So that's very important. You can kind of see all the way through here. When it's up, you can see better. And make sure your transom wall is good. So like on an outboard boat, people want to shake the motor and make sure you check the integrity of the transom. This is probably the most important part, to have a strong transom on your bottom of your boat. Then you want to check the bottom of your boat. So you go underneath here, and while you're down here, check out your trailer. So you want to check out your rollers, your bunk, everything. There's a couple minor scratches on here. Nothing through the fiberglass, which is great. There's nothing wrong with a couple minor scratches on the bottom of your boat, because when people beach it in the sand, I never beach my boat in the sand. I know better. So I always back in, throw an anchor on both sides, and just stay about this far off of the shore. I just never do that. And make sure your trailer tires are good. Make sure there's no leaking on the grease here. Make sure you might have a spare tire. These can be $150 or more, or maybe if you're lucky, $100. So make sure all these things kind of add up. If you need tires and you don't even have a spare tire, you might be $450, $500 in before you even get to use it on the lake. Make sure your trailer wires, lights work, trailer lights work also. Make sure your rollers are good, and make sure your bunks are decent. All these things add up. Let's go inside the boat. Make sure you don't have, any major fiberglass damage. Some spider cracking is not awful. It's just like the gel coat cracking, because the fiberglass is kind of flexible. So just kind of walk over the boat, make sure everything's good. I broke this latch right here. Make sure you have latches that have good handles and your hinges are good. I mean, some of these things you can just tighten up and it doesn't take that long. I guess another thing I ask for right away when I call is I ask if they have covers. So I like having snap covers, because if I'm on the lake or at my cabin, I want to snap cover it. That way I don't need the trailer cover. But make sure you have a cover. All those things add up. And a bimini top. It's super important to have a bimini top, especially if you have a kid. So there's my bimini top, and I even have a rain cover for this one. But that stuff is really important when it's 95 degrees out and sunny and you're trying to hang out and have a good time. You can put that up and have some shade. Bimini tops can be $300 to thousands of dollars. So that can save you some money. Also check to see if your ladder works good. It's dirty in here, which that's common because the water doesn't drain out that well, but that's the smallest issue of everything. What is super important is walk around every section of the floor to make sure there's no rotten or soft spots. Just make sure you step everywhere. I'm like almost 300 pounds. I want to check everything out on the floor, because if you have to do a floor, you're into some serious work and it's harder to sell. So motor, floor, and trailer are probably the most important things. And depending on what kind of condition and how much money you're spending, make sure your interior is good. Really look over the interior for rips, tears, and stains. What else is super important? Make sure your drive and your shift cables aren't very stiff, because you don't want shift cables or your shift cable to be stiff, or any of the cables in here, because that can add up. Check all your accessories, your bilge pump, and check your navigation lights. That's up. Make sure it steers easily. This one has power steering, so that'll be easier when I'm steering. I've ridden the boat, I know that it steers nicely. Make sure you check all your gauges. You want to make sure your battery gauge works, your fuel gauge, your speedo, your RPM gauge, your trim, your oil pressure gauge, and the temp of your motor. All this stuff matters. What some people overlook is testing to see how sturdy your windshield is. Sometimes these boats can get beat up pretty bad and your windshield can be super loose. And like I said, some of this stuff doesn't matter to everybody, because you're not spending, let's say, 10 grand on a boat, where I'm gonna be super picky. Sometimes you're gonna spend 1,500 on a boat, 1,000, 2,000. Some of these things you have to overlook because you're only buying a $2,000 boat. So keep that in mind when you're buying a boat. You know, what I like to do is make sure when I buy a boat, I'm gonna be super picky. That way I can spend the money on some accessory stuff. Like I wanna put a new stereo in with Bluetooth, new speakers, which I've done, LED lights underneath here so it looks cool at night. So I like to spend money doing that stuff rather than, you know, doing repairs right away. Every time when I buy a boat, I put a brand new battery in it and a brand new radio. But make sure your battery connections don't look too corroded.
Here's your tilt and trim pump. You want to make sure that doesn't leak.
Having that leak can be a pain in the butt. Or your solenoids. Make sure your trim goes up and down. You know, here's your lower end shift cable. That can be a $600 fix easy. So make sure when the boat shifts, it's smooth.
And make sure it doesn't die when you shift.
You know, just kind of overall look at your motor. The best thing to do is do a compression check, but sometimes you can't always do that. I would highly recommend you make sure you start this boat, run it for at least 10 minutes if you're not going to take it on the lake, and make sure it's not going to overheat and the lower end is pumping out a good amount of water. If it's not pumping out a good amount of water, you're going to need to impeller right away, which I recommend anyways. But you want to make sure there's no inside damage. Like I did a video of Boating Nightmare, and everything inside was kind of melted down because the previous owner overheated it, and it wasn't pumping all the water all the way. I went against my better instincts and still bought the boat. What do? You know, obviously, on like buying inboard boats compared to outboard, things vary. Like you're not going to need a blower motor, which make sure it works, for an outboard boat, but they can be $50 to replace that. Plus the time and labor. I got to take out the whole back bench on this. Bilge pump, I think, is super important. Battery gauge, temp gauge, I think that stuff's super important. I don't think the speedo gauge is that important. I put a depth finder on here that's going to have the speed anyways. But RPMs, that can be important. So in lights, I like having lights. A horn, not super important. I think by law you need one here in Minnesota, but you can buy a little can horn. So some of these things I think are kind of minor. But the lights, like I said, very important. Make sure you check that stuff out. And make sure after you run a boat for 10 minutes, I prefer taking it to the lake. Check the oil to make sure there's no milkiness in the oil. And what else to make sure? Make sure it planes right. My buddy spent $5,000 on a boat, and every time he went on plane, if he's trying to go fast, it slams up and down in the front. So no matter how far he put the trim down, it wouldn't plane right. That's super annoying. You can't even go over 30 miles an hour then. You either have to go slow or just kind of slowly cruise. That's one thing you want to make sure too. I've never seen that happen, but it happened to my buddy. So make sure you check that out. You know, along with checking all the gauges, check the radio. Just because if you don't want to spend money on a radio, make sure the radio works. Because otherwise you're going to have to spend $100 plus maybe install, depending how much work you plan on doing, to install the radio. Like I said, I enjoy just having a new radio, so I don't mind putting a radio in. And like I was talking about stress cracks, they're not the worst thing to have. It's just the gel coat usually, unless you find major damage underneath, that is alarming. So I wouldn't necessarily buy, I mean, depends on how much money you're spending. Again, if you're gonna spend $10,000, you wanna make sure you have a great boat. So I have some stress cracking up here, but it's not structural. I don't know if you can see it because a branch hit right here and it, you know, kind of bang that in. That's small compared to, you know, the big picture basically. One other thing that I check on kind of every boat I've ever bought in is open like the hatches up and check the hinges. Sometimes it can be so loose and blown out that you got to replace all the hinges. Sometimes they can just be tightened, and that's just common in a boat. Things shake around, so just tighten your hinges. You know, and that's kind of something you don't want to overlook either. Just check the stuff out. I mean, it's not the end of the world if you have some loose hinges. That's a big deal on that. And you know, check underneath the steering column too, and in the back of the boat. You don't want a bunch of rat's nest of wiring. You know, when they wired these boats new, it was probably pretty clean. So you'll be able to tell if somebody was in there messing around, not wiring things back together correctly. That's kind of important, but sometimes everything will work and you're just gonna have to go with it. Like I said, it's all the price you're gonna spend. As I was covering the boat up, I thought of some other things. When you're buying a boat, make sure it has life jackets, maybe some ropes, some bumpers. Depending on what size of boat you have, sometimes an anchor can be $100. Boat ropes can be $15 each maybe. So check this stuff out. Life jackets, you can get the orange ones for $5. But all this stuff adds up. So let's say you need trailer tires, maybe lights on it, life jackets, accessories, and there's a couple other things already here, maybe at $500 before you even get on the lake. So just make sure you have some of these things. Those are kind of minor things. You can't check everything also. So sometimes you can't open the lower end up, or unless you bring it in the shop, which if you're spending $10,000 in a boat, maybe pay a mechanic $100, $150 to open the lower end up and see what's going on in there. You know, just make sure you take your time when you're buying a boat, really look at it and see what it is. So like, get a list going. Damage on the bottom, floor is weak, you know, stuff like that. If it doesn't add up to too much, maybe that's a boat for you. Like I said, if you're spending $2,000, you can't have everything. You're gonna have rips in the interior probably. You're gonna have sun fade. You might need tires in the trailer. That's what it is. Boating is not cheap, just remember that. It's bust out another $1,000, or I call it boats with 2 T's, bust out another $2,000. Okay, sorry I talked fast in this video. I'm trying to make this video as short as possible. So again, when I call the buyer, I say, do you have covers for it? Snap covers. How are the trailer tires? Do the lights work? Is it pumping water? How's the prop? Does the engine have compression? Even tell him you're gonna check the compression. Because if he doesn't answer you back, he probably has bad compression. He doesn't want you to see that. I always recommend lake testing a boat. Get the boat in the lake, make sure there's no leaks, water's not rushing in, you know, leaking from the motor. Any of that stuff is extremely important, because you could buy a $2,000 boat, first day, need $2,000 worth of engine work. You don't want that. So I always tell the buyer you're gonna spend an hour there. It might take a half hour. Just make sure you just kind of glance over kind of everything I said. Sometimes you're gonna have to pick and choose in what you're, you know, like this boat was extremely oxidized. I polished it for 3 hours, now it looks shiny. So some things you're able to fix on your own. If you're handy, you can do a lot of this stuff. But boating is extremely expensive. I have a video, my boating nightmare with its exact boat, where I bought this boat and I had to put $2,500 into it within 4 hours of using it. So learn from my mistake, check these things over, look for signs of overheating, and hopefully you have a great time out on the lake. Thank you very much for watching the video. Check out my boating nightmare video or any of my other repair videos. Hopefully they can help you out. Thank you very much. Have a good day.